The old woman's eyes, cloudy as a winter sky, locked onto the young man's face with an intensity that stopped his breath. "Can you lend me your voice?" she whispered, her frail hand trembling as it reached for his. In the sterile quiet of the nursing home, her words carried a weight that made the air feel alive, electric with secrets. Elliot had only come to Willow Grove Nursing Home to deliver flowers, a side gig to pay for his music lessons. He was 24, lanky, with a mop of dark curls and a habit of humming under his breath. The delivery was supposed to be quick, drop off the bouquet, smile, leave. But when he stepped into room 214, he found Clara Hensley, 87 years old, sitting by the window, her wheelchair angled toward a world she could no longer walk through. Her silver hair caught the sunlight, and her face, lined with decades of stories, held a quiet urgency. "I don't understand," Elliot said, clutching the bouquet of lilies. "My voice." Clara leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Not to sing, not to shout. To speak for me. To tell someone something I can't say myself." Her fingers tightened around the armrests, and Elliot noticed a worn photograph clutched in her lap, its edges frayed from years of touch. He hesitated. The nursing home smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables, and the hum of fluorescent lights made his skin crawl. He wasn't good with old people. Too many memories of his grandmother's slow fade in a place like this. But Clara's gaze held him, not pleading, but commanding, as if she'd seen too much of life to waste time on pleasantries. "What do you need me to say?" he asked, setting the flowers on the bedside table. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes stayed sharp. "Sit. I'll tell you. But you must promise to listen, every word, and carry it exactly as I say." Elliot pulled up a chair, its metal legs scraping against the linoleum. He didn't know why he stayed. Maybe it was the way Clara's voice trembled, not with weakness, but with purpose. She began to speak, and her story unfolded like a river breaking through a dam. Clara had been a singer once, not famous, but good enough to fill small theaters in Chicago during the 1950s. Her voice, she said, could make grown men weep and women clutch their husbands' hands. But it wasn't her singing that defined her life. It was a promise she'd made at 22, to a man named Henry, her first and only love. They'd met during a summer storm, stranded in a diner, sharing a single umbrella as they ran laughing through the rain. Henry was a poet, quiet but fierce, with dreams of publishing a collection that would shake the world. "We were going to change everything," Clara said, her voice softening. "He wrote, I sang. We thought we had forever. But forever ended in 1960, when Henry was drafted into a war he didn't believe in. He promised to write her every day, and she swore she'd wait. The letters came at first, full of love and poetry, but then they stopped. Clara waited weeks, months, years. She never sang again, not after the news came that Henry was missing, presumed dead." Elliot listened, his throat tight. He wanted to ask why she needed him, why now, but Clara's story wasn't done. She spoke of the decades that followed, how she'd worked as a seamstress, raised a daughter alone, and buried her own heart with Henry's memory. The photograph in her lap was of them, young and laughing, standing under that umbrella. "I kept it all these years," she said, tracing Henry's face with a trembling finger. "But I broke my promise." "What promise?" Elliot asked, leaning closer. Clara's eyes glistened. "To find him. To tell him I never stopped loving him. I heard whispers, years later, that he might have survived, a prisoner somewhere. But I was afraid. I let life pull me away." Her voice cracked. "Now I'm too old, too weak. But you have a voice. You can find him, or whoever's left to hear it." Elliot's heart pounded. This wasn't just a message, it was a mission. He glanced at the clock. His delivery route was already behind schedule. But Clara's story had hooked him, and he couldn't walk away. "Who do I find? Where do I start?" Clara handed him the photograph. On the back was an address, faded but legible, in a small town 3 hours away. "Start there," she said. "Find anyone who knew Henry. Tell them Clara never forgot." Elliot nodded, slipping the photo into his pocket. He stood, promising to return with news. As he left room 214, he felt the weight of Clara's life in his hands, a story he was now part of. The nursing home's hall seemed brighter, the air less heavy. He didn't know what he'd find, but for the first time in years, he felt like his voice, his music, his words might matter. Elliot's beat-up hatchback rattled down the highway, the photograph of Clara and Henry tucked into his dashboard. The address led to a sleepy town called Millhaven, where the streets were lined with sagging porches and ancient oaks. He couldn't shake Clara's voice, the way it carried both grief and fire, urging him to speak for her. Millhaven was smaller than he'd expected, a place frozen in time. The address belonged to a faded yellow house, its paint peeling like old skin. Elliot knocked, his stomach twisting. What was he supposed to say? "Hi. I'm here for an old woman who thinks her long-lost love might still be alive." The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s, her graying hair pulled into a bun. Her name was Margaret, and her eyes narrowed when Elliot mentioned Henry. "Henry Whitaker," she said, her voice sharp. "Why are you asking about him?" Margaret wasn't family, but she'd grown up next door to Henry's sister, long dead. She invited Elliot inside, where the air smelled of lavender and dust. Over tea, she told him what she knew. Henry had come home from the war, broken and silent, not dead, but changed. He'd lived in Millhaven for a few years before vanishing again, leaving behind a single notebook filled with poems. Elliot's pulse quickened. "Do you have it?" "The notebook." Margaret hesitated, then retrieved it from a locked drawer. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but legible. Poems about rain, love, and a woman whose voice could mend the sky. Elliot read one aloud, his voice catching on the words. It was Clara, unmistakable. He never stopped loving her, Margaret said softly. But he thought she'd moved on. Everyone did. The twist came when Margaret mentioned a name, Lila. She was Henry's nurse in his final years in Millhaven, a young woman who'd cared for him when he was too weak to write. Lila had left town a decade ago, but Margaret had an old letter with her forwarding address a city halfway across the state. "If anyone knows where Henry went, it's her," Margaret said. She was different, kept to herself, but she loved his stories. Elliot thanked her, clutching the notebook. Driving back, he felt the story shift under his feet. Henry had survived, had written for Clara, but had chosen silence. Why? The question gnawed at him as he returned to the nursing home. Clara was waiting, her eyes searching his face the moment he entered. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot sat, the notebook heavy in his hands. He told her everything Millhaven, Margaret, the poems. Clara's face softened as he read one aloud, her fingers brushing the photograph. But when he mentioned Lila, her expression changed, a flicker of something jealousy. "Fear? Find her," Clara said. "She knows something. I feel it." Elliot nodded, though doubt crept in. What if Lila revealed something Clara couldn't bear? He left the nursing home with a new address and a promise to keep going. The notebook stayed with him, its words echoing in his mind as he drove toward the city, toward Lila, toward answers he wasn't sure he wanted. The city was a maze of glass and noise, nothing like Millhaven's quiet decay. Elliot's hands shook as he parked outside a small bookstore, the address Margaret had given him. Lila, the mysterious nurse, owned this place, or so the letter claimed. Inside, the bookstore was a haven of warm light and worn spines. Lila was behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with sharp green eyes and a quiet grace. When Elliot mentioned Henry, her face froze, then softened. "You're here for Clara, aren't you?" she said, startling him. She'd known Clara's name without prompting, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Lila led him to a back room, where she pulled out a box of letters, Henry's letters, not to Clara, but about her. He talked about her constantly, Lila said. Even when he was dying, he wrote her name in the margins. Henry had lived until 1995, frail but stubborn, refusing to contact Clara because he believed she'd built a new life. He didn't want to ruin her happiness, Lila said, her voice thick with emotion. The twist hit like a wave. Lila wasn't just Henry's nurse, she was his daughter. Born to a brief marriage after the war, she'd grown up hearing stories of Clara, the woman her father loved more than life. "He made me promise not to find her," Lila said, tears in her eyes. "But I kept his letters, his poems. I hoped one day she'd know." Elliot felt the air leave his lungs. He handed Lila the photograph, and she gasped, recognizing her father's young face. She agreed to meet Clara, to share the letters and the truth. Elliot drove her back to the nursing home, the weight of Henry's life pressing against his chest. He'd started this to help Clara, But now he was carrying a family's secrets, a bridge between past and present. When they arrived, Clara was by the window, as always. Her eyes widened at the sight of Lila, sensing something before a word was spoken. Lila sat beside her, unfolding the letters, reading Henry's words aloud. Clara wept, not with grief, but with a joy so raw it filled the room. He remembered, she whispered. He never forgot. Elliot stepped back, his role as messenger complete. But as he watched Clara and Lila, he felt something shift inside him, a longing to create, to sing, to use his voice not just for others, but for himself. He left the room quietly, the notebook still in his pocket, its poems now a part of him. Elliot stood outside the nursing home, the evening air cool against his skin. Clara's story had changed him, though he couldn't yet name how. He'd come to deliver flowers, but left with a purpose he hadn't known he needed. Back in his apartment, he opened Henry's notebook again. The poems weren't just words, they were a life, a love, a regret. Elliot's guitar sat in the corner, untouched for weeks. He picked it up, strumming softly, letting Henry's words guide his fingers. For the first time, he wrote a song, not for a gig or a paycheck, but for Clara, for Henry, for the parts of himself he'd buried. Weeks later, he returned to Willow Grove. Clara was weaker now, her breath shallow, but her eyes still burned with life. Lila was there, too, a constant presence since their meeting. Elliot played his song for them, his voice raw and unpolished, carrying Henry's poetry and Clara's love. The room was silent when he finished, save for Clara's soft sobs. "You gave me my voice back," she said, reaching for his hand. "And you found yours." Lila shared more stories, Henry's quirks, his quiet courage, his endless love for Clara. She'd started visiting other residents, reading to them, bringing the bookstore's warmth to the nursing home. Elliot, too, kept coming back, not just for Clara, but for the others, each with a story waiting to be heard. He began recording their memories, turning them into songs, giving voice to lives fading into silence. Clara passed a month later, peacefully, with Lila and Elliot by her side. The photograph of her and Henry rested on her chest, a final tether to the life she'd reclaimed. Elliot didn't cry, he sang, a quiet melody that filled the room with her spirit. He kept singing, in small venues, then larger ones, his music now infused with the weight of Clara's story. He never forgot her, or the moment she'd asked for his voice. It wasn't just hers she'd given back, it was his own.